Okay, I'm Allie Hunter. I'm going for my Master's of Science, and I'm in my second semester, so I should be graduating in spring of 2023. I'm doing this presentation on the red panda, or Aloris fulgens, and I did want to preface this with just one or two things. If you are really interested in red pandas, I would want to recommend Red Panda, Biology and Conservation of the First Panda Second Edition. About a third, maybe even a half of my references all come from this book, so it's a really great source. And also, I have a habit of rambling sometimes, and I'm going to do my best not to ramble and trip over my words, but you've been fairly warned. So, red pandas are a very distinct species. They're much smaller than their giant panda cousins, ranging anywhere between 51 to 63.5 centimeters long. Their tails also take up 28 to 48.5 centimeters, so about a third of whatever their body length is. Weight-wise, anywhere between 3.2 kilograms and 9.4. It is important to point out that males tend to max out at 9 flat kilograms. They don't go all the way to 9.4. Females tend to be just a little bit heavier, though they are not always. They have very distinct face markings with the black and white little eyebrows going on. They have ringtails similar to a raccoon's, very distinct triangle ears on a relatively small head, and no paw pads. So getting into their taxonomy, red pandas are an absolute mess. We know that they're mammalia, we know that they're carnivora, and we know that we have named them Eluridae. What that means in context of their phylogeny is a huge topic of debate when it comes to putting these guys in their taxonomic tree, which for me personally, taxonomy is a bit of my least favorite part of science because it's trying to make sense of something that really doesn't want you to make sense of it. As far as red pandas are concerned, we know that they're definitely not anywhere near the Felidae side of carnivora. They're in the Caeniformia. Where exactly they separated is completely up for debate. Some people say that they're more closely related to ursids, but then that puts them really weirdly close to polar bears and grizzly bears, and that doesn't make a ton of sense. Some people put them right next to Phorcoinids, raccoons, which makes a little bit more sense, at least to me personally, but they definitely parted from the basal Caeniformia group much earlier. Mustelids kind of makes sense to me, if for no other reason than the fact that musteloids are a just handbag of random leftover Canidae. And there are some people that still hold on to the, well, they both evolved to eat bamboo, so they must be really closely related. That's a largely debunked idea, but that is still a prevalent idea that shows up sometimes, so I thought it was probably worth mentioning. But as far as we can be sure, it seems like red pandas are just a thing all their own hanging off on the side of Caeniformia. And adding on to the confusion of what a red panda is the fact that red pandas are kind of in the middle of speciating. They do have two recognized subspecies, Aloris fulgens fulgens and Aloris fulgens diane. At this point, they're not completely separated from each other. One, because they can technically interbreed, and two, because a lot of the identifying markers that we would use to tell them apart have a lot of overlap. If you were to look at the phylogenetic tree of them, there is a very clear distinction between the eastern and western populations that separate Fulgus fulgens from Fulgens diane. When it comes down to picking them apart, I did find a nice study that broke down piece by piece what to look at for the animals. So for fulgens, you look for a relatively lighter red part of their coloration, anywhere from a pale red to a deep red, whereas Diane is at least a true red and goes all the way to a maroon color. The black markings on their legs, a Styani will at least reach their shoulder. It might go past it, whereas a Fulgens anywhere between their elbow and shoulder. The forehead coloration is very different. Styani, their face is more red, and this makes their white markings far more distinct. You can see in the picture there, very clear eyebrows, very clear white markings, very clear white muzzle, whereas with Fulgens, there's kind of just a lot of white going on the face. You can kind of see where the eyebrows are, but it's more just an impression of eyebrows than the true little like patterns. The only two things that don't really have a lot of crossover in identifying the two subspecies is Styanis have shorter ear hair, which makes it easier to see the black inside of their ear, and Fulgens have a much more contrasting color in their tail stripes, so it's easier to see the back and forth of white and orange. The global distribution of these animals, here is a slightly older study where they were marking everything, but even just in the last 6 years, their population has decreased kind of significantly. It's honestly kind of sad seeing how far it's come. So I've broken down their regional areas into the countries, since most of the studies that are done on them are kept within country borders. In Nepal, they tend to almost completely prefer being in either a broadleaf forest or a coniferous forest. They are found most frequently in the Himalayan birch and the Himalayan fir, but only about 41% of their potential habitat is protected, and of that, only 16.5% of that habitat is truly highly suited to pandas. So they don't have a lot of great options in Nepal. In India, they have a kind of different preferred habitat than anywhere else that I found. The study that I got this map from notes that they tend to prefer subtropical and temperate forests. Even in the Meghalaya area there in the southern center is a true tropical forest. However, I didn't find any studies that were highlighting that, so it won't come up later in the habitat part. In Bhutan, they again prefer the broadleaf and carnivorous forests. Anywhere that has a lot of bamboo, you're going to find a lot of pandas. I also found it nice that, at least here in Bhutan, they were protecting a lot more area and seemed to have corridors connecting all of the studied areas. China is one of the largest ranges and most well-studied ranges that I was able to find for red panda populations, how they were doing, where they were going, and the studies I found showed that where they are is heavily influenced by where the people are. If you go to an area that has a lot of people, you're not going to find nearly as many red pandas, and especially in these sections of China, the more people you have, the higher in their range the red pandas will go. They will go to higher elevations in order to better avoid people. But it is nice that a lot of these ranges are protected, and even more of them are connected by corridors, so they do have a range of motion within the areas that they are found. They're just very often pushed out of places by people's presence, and again, do tend to prefer broadleaf and coniferous forests. So habitat-wise, the broadleaf forests that you're going to be able to find red pandas in are predominantly covered in Himalayan birch and rhododendrons. The specific species of Himalayan birch is Betula utilis, and that's just what they tend to be found in a lot of the times. Rhododendrons, it could be any of a number of local species, and since they are typically found in lower parts of their elevation, 2,876 feet up to 3,800 806 meters, not feet, sorry. It tends to be a little bit on the warmer side since it's lower altitudes, and more importantly, it tends to put them closer to people. So while they are perfectly capable of living in these environments and do seem to thrive there, especially with the increased number of bamboo species they are able to choose from, they do have a tendency to be less populated in these areas, merely because at these lower altitudes you are finding more people. And the bamboo species that they are typically eating from are Japanistachyum, Bordinia, Eushania, the Manocalamus. I had to do that take several times, but there you go, the Manocalamus. So in the conifer forests, the trees tend to be more spruce, hemlock, and fir. The study I found picked out Specchia spinulosa as the spur, Tsuga dumosa as the hemlock, and Abies densa as the fir, which they are most often found in. And since these trees are a little bit more resilient, they tend to occur a little bit higher in the red pandas range, anywhere from 24,000 meters to 3,700 meters. But at this increased altitude, it does reduce the amount of fruiting plants and bamboo that they have at their disposal, usually just Eushania and Araudenaria genuses to choose from. And it also reduces, of course, the number of fruiting plants, so they're not eating as much maple or oak or barberry up that high. And I've mentioned that one of the main parts of where you're going to find pandas is where you find bamboo. That is because, as the name bamboo eater panda denotes, they are very much specialized in eating bamboo. Specifically, a study that I found saw that up to 90, I think maybe 96% of their fecal matter was Araudenaria species, but they did also eat, oh wait, here, these are the Araudenaria bamboo, but you can also find Acer species, which are maples. You can find Semicarpioflora, which is a local oak. You can also find a number of barberries and even some lichens in their diet. So they do eat around, it's just the vast majority of their diet is bamboo. So as to how they have adapted to be able to eat just bamboo, I do have a couple things that I'm saving for the fun fact section, but I do want to get into a lot of the interesting mechanical reasons that they are able to eat the way that they eat. One of the big ones is that they have adapted how their gut works to run on efficiency. They don't ruminate, they don't take forever eating food and breaking it down and making sure they get all the good stuff out of it. They run on a speed-based process. Once they eat the food and it gets into their stomach, it only takes 2 up to 4 hours max for them to work it through their system and for it to come out the other end. That way they're just taking the easy to collect nutrients and are constantly adding more into their mouth, and they're not wasting any time. They also have a habit of actively seeking out new shoots, which are higher in nutrition and contain more crude proteins. They're also able to forego a lot of the gut processes that most herbivores do by having a broadened zygomatic arch in their skull, which is the portion of the skull where jaw muscles connect. This means that they are a lot better at chewing, they have a lot more muscle going into that. So for the most part, they're not breaking down the bamboo in their stomach in digestion, they are masticating it just like crazy in their mouths, and once it is suitably turned into mush, then they'll add it to that speed system that is their intestines. And that gut system has also adapted from the way a lot of other canine species gut systems work, so that it like specifically targets and picks out proteins and fats. It's not so great at getting hemicellulose, cellulose, or lignin out of the bamboo, but having descended from carnivores, the big thing that they are worried about are proteins and fats. And the study that I found talking about all of this did make a point of just picking out that this digestive system is more efficient than the giant panda, which I thought was funny. But then, of course, that brings us to the question of why on earth do red pandas eat bamboo? And the short answer is we don't really know. I could not find any studies that really highlighted why an animal would choose to eat something that is so low quality as bamboo. Maybe it was because it's a very abundant food source, and since it is so low quality, nothing else wants to eat it. So, if it's there and no one else wants it, might as well make do. And if they did descend from a line of carnivores, as their phylogeny assumes, it's very likely that it's just easier to eat a massive amount of greens than it is to hunt all the time. So somewhere along the line, a more omnivorous red panda just decided to go for it all in on the bamboo, and it worked out. I did find a study on giant red pandas that took a look at their metabolic system and their digestion and their dopamine responses, and basically found that the giant pandas' dopamine metabolic system is incompetent. It almost doesn't function, and that probably the reason that they eat bamboo so much is because it's one of the few things that does get their dopamine system working and does encourage them to eat. And while that would explain why they continue to eat bamboo, it doesn't completely answer the question of why they started eating bamboo in the first place. So this brings us around to the fun facts, and as I promised, my first one has to do with their really terrible digestive system. We talked about how that digestive system has evolved to eat a lot all the time really quickly, and one of the main reasons for that is that their intestines never change shape to be more herbivorous. They still have the intestines of a carnivore, which are much, much too small to effectively break down cell walls and get the actual good stuff out of them. So they're able to get enough nutrition out in the wild, but it does present some difficulties in captivity, because unless you have your own source of bamboo or live, in Asia where you have ready sources of bamboo, it's very difficult to bring in enough bamboo to support a red panda in the same way that they would be eating in the wild. So this results in pandas that are eating some amount of bamboo, but are also being supplemented with things like omnivore biscuits or leaf eater biscuits, grapes and apples and bananas and all those kinds of things. And while the pandas eat them readily, and a lot of red pandas really love apples and grapes, they're not getting the same kind of nutrition as they would in the wild. And I know, at least from my personal work with red pandas at Ogilvy, it's not uncommon for them to go through what we call the blahs, where they just have a bad time for a week because their guts feel bad because they haven't been able to eat enough bamboo, and so their stool gets very loose and they just kind of have tummy aches for a little bit, and then they get back to normal. Fun fact number 2 is that pandas have the most adorable little grabby hands that you have ever seen. These guys live most, if not all, of their lives up in the trees, so they are highly adapted for climbing, to the point that they do not have any metatarsal pads, and their plantar pads are very reduced to the point that you really can't hardly see them through all the fur. And that fur is very heavy and long, likely adapted so that they can hang out in the very cold, snowy terrain and not, lose fingers. Their hands are also very articulate. They have semi-retractable claws. This helps them climb, helps them pull their food in and hold bamboo correctly. I think I have a picture in here later of a panda just holding a kebab of fruit, so they're very tactile. And the thing that really got me and turned this into a fun fact is that their paws have mystery glands. They have glands in their paws that secrete an odorless and colorless fluid, and the author of the paper who was talking about this had no idea why they were there. So they just got some cool little random juices coming out of their paws. Oh, and there's a close-up of his little paw. Yes, okay, there is the picture of him holding a little kebab. But red pandas also have a gene that should be helping them taste umami, but has, where is it, the nucleotide in the 6th exon of TAS1R1 has been deleted and has basically rendered this gene, which is responsible for tasting umami, useless. So while they did descend from carnivores, who, for the same reasons that it's important for the giant panda to eat bamboo to stay happy and continue eating, red pandas in the past would have had an umami gene so that when they ate meat, they're like, okay, good, I was eating something and it made me happy, so the next time I find that, I should eat it again so I continue to be happy. Somewhere in their genetic line, that gene started to degrade, probably well after they started eating bamboo and no longer had the need for a dopamine response to eating something that was savory. And so after however long, that's no longer a thing that they can taste. And unfortunately, that's the last of my fun facts, so that brings us around to the impairment of the red panda. The most immediate thing that comes to mind when it comes to impairment of the red panda is domestic animals, particularly livestock and dogs. Livestock is a problem for red pandas. When you have herds moving into an area, sometimes there's habitat destruction that goes along with it, though a lot of areas out there actually just let their animals go off into the woods. The problem more so comes from the disruption of the animals in the red panda's habitat. They don't really like hanging around with giant herd animals, and it's completely possible that somebody's domestic cow is just going to trample a bunch of the bamboo. Particularly in Bhutan, the yak population has increased by 50% since the 90s, and the more cows there are, the more disruption is happening. But the more present danger to red pandas really is dogs. It's pretty common for farmers to just let their dogs have the run of the woods. That way they're able to keep predators away, keep their livestock safe. But there have been reports of dogs killing red pandas, as well as interfering with maternal behavior. So a mom is less likely to take proper care of their kid if they're worried about a dog trying to eat them. And the paper didn't mention this, but I would say it's probably affecting breeding behaviors as well. It's hard to pursue somebody when you're worried about your own hide. And of course, like most species, red pandas are affected by global warming. Luckily, their preferred bamboo, Ardenaria, is not super affected by the warm. It's pretty resilient, can grow just about anywhere. However, red pandas themselves are not as okay with the heat. Their typical environment stays between negative 6.5 degrees Celsius and 19 degrees Celsius. And so they're very much cold adapted. And even in captivity, keepers are recommended to keep enclosures below 25 degrees Celsius. And there have been studies that show that when the temperature gets too high, the threshold temperature was 27 degrees Celsius or higher, there is increased mortality, especially in young red pandas, like infants. And then, of course, like a lot of animals, the biggest problem facing their continued existence is habitat loss. I think I mentioned that people, just the presence of people, tends to scare red pandas away. So the more people you have in an area, the less red pandas you have in an area. As well as when people go in to build houses and expand their homes, they are, one, putting more people in that area. They're, two, taking wood and bamboo and things away to build their houses with. And they are probably also clearing spaces for the domestic animals they're bringing in. Their cows, their yaks, their sheep, their dogs. All of that is kind of playing into each other. And then, of course, tourism happens in these beautiful places where people want to come and see all of the natural beauty, and probably some people run off into the woods specifically hoping to spy a red panda, and all of that is just really counterintuitive to their feeling of safety in their habitat and makes them more likely to leave and try to find somewhere else to live. And as these places also get more tourism and more people in the area, there are going to be more lights and more noises and more people partying into the night and completely disrupting the animals' attempts at living their normal lives. And more people there tends to mean more roads, more train tracks, and as typically goes along with this, more severing of habitats, more severing of pathways between habitats, more dead red pandas on the road because someone hit them with a car. None of it is good. All of it is bad. It's habitat loss. It's the same across the board for all species, but these guys, given that they only occur in high altitudes anyway, when you start encroaching on their space, it can become really detrimental really fast. But of course, we haven't lost them yet. They're still very much alive in the wild, and while it is difficult to get good population indexes on them, given their small size, their easy ability to hide as he's hanging out there in that broadleaf tree, and the fact that they live in a pretty remote and pretty cold climate, it can be hard to make sure that you're getting a good count. I did break down how many of them there are in the wild based on country again, because that tends to be how the studies are broken down. Nepal specifically decided to count their red pandas in an average of how many there are per kilometer squared. There may be as many as 1 for every 2 kilometers squared in some areas, and other areas are much less dense at 1 for every 178 kilometers squared. India took an index of a couple of different counties, which I compiled together. So at minimum, they have somewhere in the range of 324 pandas, up to a maximum somewhere at 863. Bhutan and Myanmar did not have accurate counts of their pandas, but the study did pick out that since Bhutan is developing its economy pretty quickly, that they are probably putting strain on what population is there, and Myanmar was noted as having pretty common interactions with red pandas. Locals would sometimes accidentally catch them in traps trying to keep pests out of their barns and out of their food, and so they would have to re-release them. China did have a pretty good count, somewhere between 3,000 and 7,000 individuals. They also seem to be the nation that had put the most effort into studying the red panda populations there. The unfortunate part was it did seem as though the population had decreased by around 40% in the second half of the 20th century. This captive population also has some really good research going on with it and a lot of stuff going on for its reproductive future, and I will get into that during the recovery part of this. Speaking of recovery, the first one that I wanted to talk about was the in situ conservation that is being done for these guys. This study in particular was in regards to Nepal and the work that they were doing with local communities to help educate and get the locals involved with actually wanting to protect the red pandas. It's a lot easier to do our jobs if the locals aren't sitting over there in the corner grumbling because, we could be using that area for farmland, and instead they want their little mascot over there eating bamboo. So they educate the younger individuals, and for individuals who are interested, they train them to help out with work on the pit corridor, just connecting two of the protected areas that they know pandas live in. They also help train them in habitat management so that everyone's able to contribute to the continuation of the species and making sure that they have safe, suitable habitats. So, in zoos, we do have a pretty good recovery program going on involving the full global captive population. This study looked over a whole bunch of different stuff and found that in order to retain 90% of genetic diversity over the next 100 years, for Fulgens, you need an effective population of 607 individuals in captivity, which is a lot, and is much more than we currently have. And unfortunately, with the number of zoos that we have that would be like viable for keeping red pandas, we do not have enough space to keep a 90% genetically diverse population over the next 100 years for Fulgen styani. The best we could probably do is maintain 87.9% genetic diversity with 660 individuals. This paper also talked about the probability of wanting to breed the individuals that we know we have in our stud books with other captive populations that are not in the stud book. That way, it would help prevent genetic depression without having to take from the wild. However, they also suggested that taking from the wild on occasion might be helpful to create new genetic founders. They actually went through and kind of ran up a couple of different possibilities and found that the best way to retain genetic diversity would be if we added 2 individuals every 3 years, and this was assuming that there would be a growth rate of about 5% every year. They did also make a point of saying that inbreeding is something that definitely contributes to mortalities in red panda infants, and that because programs in this program can be pretty insular, they went through and found that most groups had an inbreeding coefficient of about 0.83 up to 0.92, but if you crossbred individuals between programs within their stud books, you could get down to 0.018 or 0.07 inbreeding coefficient. So that's much better, and they highly recommended breeding between programs. They also took a minute to talk about the reintroduction protocol and admitted that there would definitely be a period of trial and error figuring out the best way to re-release individuals. And when releasing those individuals, they would require close observation and rigorous study. So that way, once all of the rules were established and we had a good way of releasing individuals without high mortality rates, we could then kind of cherry pick individuals who were overrepresented in captivity and ideally also underrepresented in the wild, and release those individuals to the wild to help increase the wild population without doing too much damage to the captive breeding genetic diversity. And my final recovery slide is on a study that worked on telemetry across their entire population. They did habitat prediction. They picked out things that were important to maintaining red panda populations, and they actually separated out for Styanies and Fulgen. And using that, they were able to make a model that showed areas that showed low suitability, moderate suitability, and high suitability for red pandas. And of that entire run-through, they found that only 30% of the potential habitat that they found was actually in protected areas, and that's potential habitat, so even the stuff that was considered low suitability was included in that. The paper calls for a shift in how we are doing our rehabilitation and taking care of areas, to do less fixing of areas and do more buying of areas, so that we are able to have control over and protect areas that have high suitability, that have at least moderate suitability, and are ensuring that, we are keeping the pandas safe. I also thought it was very interesting that we were able to create what is essentially a baseline for if we do need to start repairing red panda habitats, and if that becomes an issue again, we have a much better framework of how best to do that. And then, of course, I just want to leave off with my slogan to please, please, please protect the panda's precious paws. Thanks.